Since 1905, the German High Command had been planning how to fight and how to win a two-front war. They were following the Schlieffen Plan, which you've heard about. So they would bypass France's formidable border security and instead sweep through undefended Belgium, enter Paris in, don't you love it, precisely 42 days, and then turn to defeat the more slowly mobilizing Russians. And it worked very well in 1940. It did not work in 1914, and at the Battle of the Marne, just 25 miles short of Paris, the French, British, and Germans fought to a standstill. I've circled the battleground on the map. 2 million men fought in this battle and 500,000 died, most killed by heavy artillery, that is, shells from cannon and machine guns. By mid-September 1914, trenches had been dug from Switzerland to the English Channel, and that's the black line you see on the map. The trenches and the battle line would barely move for the next 4 years. In 1916, the French, British, and German armies would fight for 10 months to capture the town of Verdun, circled on the lower map, or to try to capture it. Together, the armies suffered close to 1 million casualties. Note these huge numbers and think about the kind of effect that this would have on people's attitude to the war and the future. This was a deliberate war of attrition. So what does that term mean, a war of attrition? It means basically defeating an enemy by wearing it down. General Grant, by the way, pursued a war of attrition in the American Civil War. This slide gives you a few scary facts. Can you believe that there was 1 soldier for every 4 inches of trench? But to really get a feel for how terrible life in the trenches could be, let's turn to the eyewitness accounts in your reading, and then we'll watch a short video clip about life in the trenches. So, why did it happen? What do you think? Why did millions of men hole up in the trenches for 4 years, unable to move and being killed by the hundreds of thousands? Well, the answer, in addition to military leadership stupidity, basically was technology. What technology? So this short video clip is going to give you one answer, the beginning of an answer. In theory, at least, World War I machine guns could fire more than 500 bullets a minute, and that number would more than double by the end of the war. In practice, machine guns often overheated, they often broke down in the damp trenches. Still, they left any soldier who was caught out in the open with terrible odds of survival. Interesting little note here. I love the history of technology. The machine gun most used in World War I was invented by an Englishman, Hiram Maxim. The British Army used an earlier version of his Maxim gun in its imperialist wars in Africa. I've included a little poem from Hilaire Belloc, who's sort of a humorous English poet. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. But Maxim couldn't actually persuade the British Army to buy his new and much improved oil-cooled gun. The German army leadership was much more scientifically inclined, less skeptical of new inventions. They purchased 12,000 and had them ready at the beginning of the war, which almost gave the war to the Germans. The British High Command was also slow to figure out how dramatically the machine gun had changed the nature of warfare. Basically, they didn't change their tactics. Instead, they kept trying to break out of the stalemate by attempting traditional infantry assaults. In other words, by just shoving hundreds and thousands of young men into machine gun fire. This, by the way, is going to have huge political consequences that we'll talk about in the next unit. For soldiers, in the meanwhile, it was pretty much mass suicide. I've mentioned the Battle of Verdun, so let's watch a short video clip about the next huge attempt at an offensive, which was the Battle of the Somme, 2 years later. As the war dragged on, military leaders sought desperately to find some way to break out into the offensive, regain the initiative, get out of the trenches. One of the most gruesome choices they made was to introduce poison gas. It was actually introduced first by the Germans. So let's return to the readings for first-hand accounts of this horror. And here, if you have time, is a brief clip from a German movie which captures some of the horror. So what do you think? What other weapons, what other technology helped the military eventually regain the offensive? I'll give you a hint. Offensive war would rule the early years of World War II, and no one did it better than the Germans. Okay, I'm hoping somebody guessed the tank. Armor was not exactly a new idea in warfare, right? Remember those knights on horseback? Neither, as you can see from this 15th century sketch by Leonardo da Vinci, admittedly a very forward-looking fellow, was the idea of combining armor with mobility. But of course, the main form of mobility was the horse. Horses did not fare any better against machine gun than people did. So, why did tanks finally emerge as a battlefield weapon in World War I and much more in World War II? What was the big technological breakthrough? Well, the caterpillar tracks that were already used on tractors were part of the answer. So were mounting machine guns on vehicles, but the big breakthrough was actually the same breakthrough that gives you mobility and maybe even a little offensive and armor against your parents as soon as you or one of your friends turns 16, the internal combustion engine. So, any guess about why this very early British tank was called the Landship? Well, in December 1914, there was a demonstration by a group of inventors of a crawling vehicle that had held machine guns and was covered with armor. The military leaders who were watching weren't very impressed. It's worth keeping in mind that the British Army at this point was still dominated by cavalry officers, that is, guys who rode around on horses. They did not seem to have fully absorbed the lessons of the Battle of Crécy, much less the Battle of the Marne. But one of the young politicians in attendance was very intrigued. His name was Winston Churchill, and he thought this might be a way to break out of the stalemate that was already developing on the Western Front. Trouble is, Churchill didn't have any responsibility for what the army did. He was the First Lord of the Admiralty, which means he was the top political officer of the Navy, or official for the Navy, what we would call the Secretary of the Navy. Well, this didn't stop Churchill. He named the newfangled machines Landships and started using Navy money to develop them. And to this day, we still describe tanks using naval terms. Turret, the gun mount, was a term used for gun mounts on battleships. A tank's outer skin is still called a hull. Soldiers enter through a hatch. A bulletproof tank window is called a porthole. Even the term tank is usually used to describe something that holds water. You get the picture. So the British first used tanks 2 months into the Battle of the Somme, and they were not a big success. So 49 tanks were shipped to the Somme, not probably enough to have made a difference anyway, and only 32 of them worked well enough to begin the assault. Only 9 made it all the way to no man's land. Even those ended up working pretty poorly. The military hadn't figured out ventilation, for example, so the tanks often flooded with carbon monoxide, which is fatal, and internal temperatures tended to go up as high as 122 degrees Fahrenheit, which did not put people much in the mood to fight. Entire crews passed out without firing a shot. Here, by the way, is a photo of tanks during the Battle of the Somme. If it doesn't look like they're fighting very hard, they are, in fact, stuck in the mud. Nevertheless, the tanks made an impression. So let's stop to take a look at still another eyewitness account in your reading. But not all World War I naval machines crawled over land. Can you think of another military machine that increased mobility and made its first big mark in World War I? Whoops. I've lost my notes on this for some reason. Submarines were actually, believe it or not, first used in the American Revolution by a young American college student who figured out a way to use bicycle wheels to drive a submersible up against British ships and attempted to attach explosives. It didn't work very well. The Germans, again, faced a very big problem in fighting the British, similar to the one that Napoleon had faced, which is, what do you do about a country that's difficult to invade and is sending troops to the continent of Europe? Well, the answer is you try to get their shipping, and the submarines proved to be a very effective way to do this. This is the picture of a German U-boat. Submarines also proved to be Germany's undoing. Does anybody know why I say that? Well, basically, the unrestricted submarine warfare that Germany announced infuriated the Americans because it attacked American shipping and it led America to enter the war, and that was probably the fatal decision. So there's a lot more I could say about technology, but I've still left out one really big new war machine. And what's that? So the first airplane flight was 1903, and the first airplane crossed the English Channel in 1909. In other words, when World War I began in 1914, just 5 years later, airplanes were still a very new, very crude technology. They were very likely to crash before they had a chance to attack. And in fact, most early military pilots died in training before they had a chance to fly against an enemy. Once they did fly against enemies, not very many survived combat either. The lifespan of a military pilot was measured in months, if not days. But airplane technology developed very rapidly during World War I, and by the end of the war, planes were used not just to spy on enemy movements, but to bomb strategic sites and to fight the other side's airplanes, that in other words, bombers and fighters. But this technology, too, would really come into its own in World War II. Well, obviously, I am skipping over a lot of war, a lot of battles, a lot of interesting events. So let's watch a short video clip about the last days of the war, which will also introduce the next subject in our course, which is the Russian Revolution, and the Peace Conference, which brought anything but peace.